Rafe, Nigel there saying that their grievances aren't really justified because they haven't formulated any sort of end game.
It's not up to the people to propose solutions. It's up to our politicians to propose solutions. Look, violence is never justified. The horrific acts we've seen here, and also by armed Muslim gangs rampaging the streets as well, none of that is to be justified, and I deplore all of it. But of course, there are many more millions of people who share the same levels of anger, but aren't choosing to be violent, who are concerned about the dramatic deterioration of their towns and cities. You know, from the old mill towns of the north to the heart of our capital city, towns and cities have become completely unrecognizable to the generations that once called them home, and not in good ways. You know, dramatic rise in rape and sexual abuse. We've seen in Rotherham, for example, where a migrant hotel was attacked. That was at the center of the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs with the industrial scale rape of young girls. We've seen machete gangs on the streets. I mean, the quality of life in our most neglected towns and cities is terrible, and people are reacting against it. And the majority of the British public understand this. We just had a poll up by YouGov where 62% of Britons understand that these riots are linked to immigration.
Musharraf, Rafe, they're putting forward some points in mitigation for the actions we're seeing on the streets, whilst in no way justifying violence, of course. Musharraf, if I could ask you to answer those points.
Well, first of all, I don't recognise the Rotherham or the Britain that Ray is describing. I live in one of the most deprived areas of certainly of UK in Hyson Green. I see nothing of the kind. I think what this I think we must not forget those 3 innocent 7, 8, 9-year-old girls that were murdered. We have forgotten that, and people have hijacked that tragedy for what? For their anti-Muslim feelings, for what over the last 3 decades the media and certain so-called think tanks, really, which are setups funded by right-wing extremists, have created an air of dislike and hatred of the Muslims. And that is why Runnymede Trust, nearly 30 years ago, after seeing all that, coined the term Islamophobia, this anti-Muslim sentiment. Sadly, you know, we must not allow people to get away with this nonsense about immigration.
Fraser, Musharraf made the point that these people on the streets have hijacked the awful crime that was perpetrated in Southport, the murder of those 3 girls. Some people say they're not hijacking it, they're actually saying it's the final straw and I must get out on the street and protest. Which one is it?
Well, on that point, I certainly agree with Musharraf. I've spent the weekend in Southport and there's absolutely no sympathy for these vile riots there. These people are recovering from a really shocking tragedy, a tragedy that has nothing really in particular to do with Islam, nothing to do with immigration. It only seems to be misinformation that has made those connections. But having said that, you know, there are concerns out there in the country. I don't think the rioters are expressing this, by the way. You know, attacking migrant hotels is not an appropriate way to channel that anger. But the public are angry about immigration, historically unprecedented levels of both legal and illegal immigration. There doesn't seem to be any plan from the establishment as to how best to deal with this. How do we integrate people into our societies? How do we provide the necessary infrastructure? The message from the top down seems to be just accept that this is happening and be quiet about it, just shut up. I think that is unsustainable. I don't want to link that to the rioting anyway. I don't think any of that is excusable whatsoever. But if we are going to have this conversation about immigration, I think that is, you know, we need to recognise that that's where we are, where people feel they are angry and they feel they're being silenced.
Nigel Nelson, we spoke to someone who on Wednesday evening was kettled outside of Downing Street in that protest. He was a citizen journalist, and he said the people there were not all far right, far from it. There were lots of elderly people there, well-meaning people there, who had come down in solidarity with what had happened in Southport, but it was the police action that forced their hand and turned it violent. Can I ask you if you think the protesters are mainly far right or only a tiny minority?
No, I think the protesters are mainly far right, and the reason that I would give them that label is that they are people who support the ideology and methodology of fascist parties, and that includes street violence and intimidation. Now, how the police deal with it obviously varies from place to place. There have been these accusations of two-tier policing, that they haven't treated Black Lives Matter or the pro-Palestinian protesters in the same way. Each demonstration is different. Black Lives Matter and the Palestinian demonstrators didn't go around wrecking the country. The police are coming down so hard on these people because they are, and they claim to be patriots.
Nigel, if I may,
they're patriotic about.
Yeah, but Nigel, if I may, there was violence even against the police in Leeds. There was threatening words in Rochester. The police were injured in East London when there was a inter-Bangladeshi community violence. There was no hint of that police presence that we're seeing now. And the argument is it's because they were ethnic minorities and not white people.
Well, I don't buy that. The demonstrations were simply different. And what you had in this case was intelligence that people were coming to these places with the intention of causing violence. That is why the police presence was what it was. That's why they were dressed in riot gear, because it wasn't happening at other demonstrations.
I need to bring Rafe in at that point. Rafe, do you agree with that?
I don't recognise this at all. I mean, even to use the word demonstrations, when what we saw in Leeds were riots, and we saw the British police running away from rioters when they were from ethnic minority backgrounds, in this case Roma and some Muslim, as opposed to charging forward on the protesters, quite rightly, as we saw in the riots in Southport and elsewhere. We've had this time and again. We saw this same thing happening in 2011 when you had the left media establishment saying we need to understand the reason why people from the black ethnic community feel a sense of injustice while they're rioting. Those were the last time we had big riots. In 2020, Black Lives Matter rioted. Oh, well, we must deal with racism in our society. When the white working class are rioting, there's none of that. Suddenly they are fascists, they must be shut down. There's no attempt made to try to understand why they feel that they're losing their country, why they feel dispossessed.
I think it is time that we say it, see it, sorted. Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiments, racism, right-wing fascism. That is what we are seeing.
Can we just pause the debate for a minute and take a look at these new measures that Keir Starmer is bringing in? Here they are.
I utterly condemn the far-right thuggery. The police will be making arrests. Individuals will be held on remand. Charges will follow, and convictions will follow. I guarantee you will regret taking part in this disorder.
Keir Starmer has done all he can to show how angry he is at the disorder on Britain's streets.
Be in no doubt, those that have participated in this violence will face the full force of the law.
He's only been Prime Minister for a matter of weeks, but metaphorically, he's taking no prisoners. In reality, taking prisoners is exactly what he plans to do.
Justice Secretary was actually confident that there were enough prison spaces.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced a new police task force.
These thugs are mobile. They move from community to community. And we must have a policing response that can do the same.
Some, however, have described the plans as Orwellian in their scope.
Any person organising or taking part in the procession is committing an offence.
He gave what I consider to be the most divisive speech that a politician, let alone a PM, has ever given in this country.
Here's exactly what the British government's planning. 43 police forces will share intelligence about possible protests to coordinate a response.
We will have a standing army of specialist officers.
Transport police will monitor unusual surges on the travel network as an early warning that trouble could be ahead. Mobile facial recognition cameras, normally only used in London, will now be used countrywide.
Silky Carlo from Big Brother Watch has said, this facial recognition technology they're talking about using has been banned in Europe.
Police will get new powers to stop anyone hiding their identity behind masks. and will have the power to stop anyone from travelling who is deemed to be drunk or disruptive.
Criminal behaviour orders to restrict their movements before they can even board a train.
Travel bans will carry prison sentences of up to 5 years if broken.
The police will be making arrests, individuals will be held on remand, charges will follow, and convictions will follow.
But Starmer is not just getting tough on the streets.
I've been absolutely clear that the criminal law applies online as well as offline.
The British Prime Minister has talked about dealing with the spread of online misinformation, a task which has proved difficult for his predecessors.
But it'll be interesting to see whether the government puts any more pressure on social media companies to come up with more solutions to deal with some of the disinformation.
That's a favourite of politicians.
Yes.
Oh, blame social media. It's nasty Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg.
The message from the government is
anyone who gets involved in criminal disorder, violent thuggery on our streets will have to pay the price.
Fraser Myers, I know that you write a lot on civil liberties. Are the British expected now to give up very fundamental civil liberties in order for Keir Starmer and his government to make us all feel safer?
It feels that way almost at every crisis point. I mean, first of all, I should emphasise that if someone is caught rioting or if someone is caught looking like they're planning to riot, then they need to be met with the full force of the law. That I don't think is in dispute or in debate. But what I worry about is that every time new measures are introduced to deal with what's perceived to be a new threat, then we lose our liberties for good. So we're talking about introducing facial recognition. Now, we know facial recognition doesn't actually work, and that lots of innocent people are continually hauled into police cells as a result of facial recognition. We're talking about cracking down on disinformation online. Now, that's particularly dangerous because it means effectively allowing either the government or social media firms to set up a kind of ministry of truth where they get to decide what is true or what is false, what is fact, what is fiction. No government has the capacity to do that. It's absolutely inevitable that entirely normal points of view, perhaps even correct facts, will end up being censored as a result of that. We saw that happening throughout the pandemic, for instance. So I'm very worried about this crackdown. I absolutely want to see people behind bars who are taking part in the rioting, but whenever we introduce new tiers of measures, that always has the capacity to go wrong. That will always have a much longer tail than the rioting themselves, and we should be much more worried about that.
Dr. Hussain, do you think that Keir Starmer is going too far with these new measures?
I'm not too keen on too much surveillance, but what I'm trying to say is he has a better alternative, which is let us improve our citizens. Let us help our citizens to become much more morally responsible people. And that is sadly what is missing in our society. And increasingly, the more we rely on these technologies, we are going to be depriving people, and we are actually letting their conscience die effectively. We need to go back to our humanity, which is about being kind, about being good to each other and respecting one another. And that cannot happen if our educational system isn't repaired. It doesn't matter how much surveillance we will have. But so I really would urge the government to think more about how we begin to build these wonderful, good citizens, responsible citizens.
Nigel Nelson, just picking up on what Fraser Myers said, you know, these things, these laws have unintended consequences and they will last a very long time. Does what Keir Starmer is doing worry you?
Well, the laws are already in place, so it's not as if we're dealing with emergency powers, and if we were, then Parliament would have to be recalled. What we're dealing with here is something that is absolutely urgent. So the measures that Keir Starmer is taking are proportionate to the urgency they must be dealt with. So step one is stop the riots. Step two will be to deal with the social media firms who are spreading bile without jeopardizing free speech. Free speech carries with it a duty to use it responsibly. And then we can move on to actually showing the rioters they're being exploited by outside forces. And they are more like a shoal of fish than any kind of traditional organization. And they should be aware that they are being used.
Rafe, final word for you?
Anyone who thinks, as Nigel has just intimated, that what we've seen on the streets has been orchestrated by foreign powers and bad actors within the UK simply doesn't have a clue what's going on, the reality of what's going on in our neglected towns and cities. And we should all be hugely worried about what is possibly going to be a sinister suppression of free speech by attacking some of the social media platforms, which have been the only outlets to actually show the full story of what's been happening on our streets, things that the mainstream media won't address. And people who think that the politicians and media who think comments on social media are incendiary, many of those views are held by millions of people in this country. And I think we're going down a very dangerous path, particularly also with the Labour government's proposed new plan to entrench a very loose definition of Islamophobia, which would make even legitimate criticism of the religion of Islam illegal.
Rafe, Fraser, Musharraf and Nigel, thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.